It's Monday, 27th October 2025. A quick look at some of the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. We will begin with Vanguard. The leading story on Vanguard paper says, NECA, man, Nsima rejects Senate's NSITF takeover. The writer says, warn against politicization of Workers' Fund. Say move to amend Act threatens transparency, violates ILO's convention. You can get the story on page 4 of the Vanguard newspaper. Now, at the top of the leading stories, 𝐓𝐴 Empowering Futures. 𝐓𝐴 is set to host the Empowering Futures Conference 2025. You can read the complete story on page 20 of the Vanguard newspaper. Now, at the top of the newspaper, we have Dangote expands refinery capacity to 1.4 million barrels per day. You can get the complete story on page 15. Besides the Dangote story, Nigeria loses $6.8 billion to oil production shortfalls in 8 months. You can get the complete story on page 19 of the Vanguard. At the topmost of the newspaper, Soludo's campaign moves to Orumba. You can read the story on page 15 of the Vanguard newspaper. Now, below the picture, we have SERAP to NNPCL. Accounts for missing 22.3 billion naira, $49.7 million, 14.3 million euros, and 5.2 million pounds oil funds. You can read the complete story on page 8 of the Vanguard newspaper. Beside the story, we have Access Holdings gross earnings up to 13.8% or to 2.5 trillion naira. You can also read the complete story on page 5 of the Vanguard. Beside the story, we have resident doctors declare indefinite nationwide strike from October 31st. You can also read the story on page 5 of the Vanguard newspaper. Now we'll move over to Daily Trust. So the leading story here says, farmers, federal government disagree over drop in food prices. You can read the complete story on page 3 and 4. Above the leading story, we have 𝐓𝐴 Empowering Futures. 𝐓𝐴 is set to host the Empowering Futures Conference 2025. Beside the picture, we have high rents driving us out of Abuja, says residents. You can get the story on page 5 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Killings, Nigerian Muslims also victims, says Vatican Cardinal. You can read the complete story on page 6 of the Daily Trust newspaper. 5 teenagers die in Gombe boat mishap. And you can get the complete story on page 42. Now, Dangote refinery expands capacity to 1.4 million barrels per day. You can get the complete story on page 24 of the Daily Trust newspaper. And now we'll move over to The Guardian. And our leading story here says 767 local government areas without active websites amid autonomy, 3 trillion naira yearly windfall. You can get the complete story on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper. Below the leading headlines, we have organized private sector opposes move to amend NSTIF Act. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the Guardian newspaper. Below the story, we have Constitution Review, how Kalu pushed for additional Southeast state. You can get the complete story on page 7 of the Guardian newspaper. Now we have fragile structures, egos derail opposition as PDP fumes SDP splinters. You can read the complete story on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper. And we have resident doctors to begin strike Friday over unmet demands. You can get the complete story on page 4 of the Guardian newspaper. Ayadetiwa clears backlog of Ondo police salary arrears. You can read the complete story on page 5 of the Guardian newspaper. And below the stories, we have why we are expanding our refinery to 1.4 million barrels per day by Dangote. You can get the complete story on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. Crush terrorism now, Nigerians task news service chiefs. You can read the complete story on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. Now the last one here says it takes 62 signatures to pay one NDDC contractors, says 𝐓𝐨𝐻𝐸. You can read the complete story on page 7 of the Guardian newspaper. Now over to the Punch newspaper. And here our leading story says 500 generals forced out despite rising insurgency. And the writer says ex-generals warn of crisis as Buhari, Tinubu eras lose young generals to early retirement after shakes-ups. You can read the complete story on page 2 of the Punch newspaper. And above the newspaper, we have 2027 Abure Oti LP factions at war over Obi ADC pact. You can read the complete story on page 44 of the Punch newspaper. And beside the picture, we have economic recovery has begun, says Edun. You can get the complete story on page 35 of the Punch newspaper. Delta deploys Airbus A330-900 on Nigerian route. You can read the complete story on page 35 of the Punch newspaper. Now below the picture, we have CBN pumps $1.25 billion into fuel imports, others in 3 months. You can get the complete story on page 31 of the Punch newspaper. 5 pregnant girls rescued from baby factory. You can read the complete story on pages 4 and 5 of the Punch newspaper. Now, Soludo's 1 million naira promise for voters to curb apathy, says Abga. You can read the complete story on page 44 of the Punch newspaper. These are the headlines making waves in Nigeria today. If any of the headlines caught your attention, you can get a copy of the paper and read the complete story.